This time we're going to dismiss junior church, third grade and below. Third grade and below. You know, this Sunday is supposed to be National Back to Church Sunday. So I was advertising that, but I think some people went back to church at another place. The crowd's not as big as I was hoping this morning. I'm just kidding. I'm glad to have everybody here this morning, and certainly always a good day when you start out your day in church. And so thank you for being here this morning, and our visitors as well that we have this morning. Glad to have you be here. Today I'm continuing my series, The Eyes Have It. This is the second part of the sermon series that I began last week. Last week we talked about our eyes being the lamp to our soul. And today we're going to talk about a plank in your eye. Now, we're all familiar with this story that Jesus told, probably a certain amount, or fairly familiar with it, in Matthew chapter 7. If you want to follow along, our text will be Matthew 7, verses 3 through 5, or you can follow along in your outline in the bulletin there on the screen. But I want to talk about this text, if you want to follow along as I read it. Of course, Jesus started out chapter 7 by talking about not judging one another, which is a very popular verse that people like to quote, even though they use it out of context. But then he goes on right after that and says, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will be able to see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." And so this is the text of the speck and the plank, or if you have the King James, it might say mote and a beam. But the point of that is that a speck is something very small, like just a fine speck of sawdust or a mote. It's just a very small speck that you can hardly see. And then a plank or a beam is something like this. It's pretty big, isn't it? Milo was up there standing on my plank. And when I told her, I said, that's for my object lessons. I was hoping nobody moved it. It was still up there. But you see the contrast of what Jesus was trying to say. I felt like Hacksaw Jim Duggan. Oh! Or maybe how many of y'all remember Buford Puzzle? Old sheriff in Tennessee carried a stick around. But you see the contrast to what he was trying to say was, here you're worried about some little speck that you can hardly see in someone else's eye, while the whole time you get a big old beam sticking out of your eye. So, I mean, it's, people that say Jesus don't have a sense of humor, or better yet, I love sarcasm. And he uses some sarcasm here to talk about how hypocritical people are, and so he goes into this. But I want to talk about the first thing, and that's the question we need to ask ourselves: what's in your eye? You know, you can almost barely see in this picture up there. There's a little speck in the guy's eye, and the other guy's got a big old, I would say 2x4, but this is actually a 2x6, so I couldn't find the 2x4, so that's why my plank's really big. I should have cut it too. This was kind of heavy. But you see the picture there, and he asked that in verse 3 there. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? Now I will say this: if you've ever been cutting something and you get a little sawdust in your eyes, it does hurt. It's irritating, but I can't imagine how painful it would be to have a big old beam sticking out of your eye. But he asked that question: how can you look at this person and a little speck, a tiny speck of sawdust is barely visible, and then pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? Yet that's what we do. We ignore what's going on in our lives because we're too busy worried about what's going on in other people's lives. And the big deal about that is many times what they've got going in their life is so small and insignificant that it don't really matter. And there's a big, obvious, bigger problem or sin or something going on in our lives that's quite large and significant, yet we ignore that and we want to do that. And Christians, by reputation or not, are notorious for doing that because we have a tendency sometimes to become holier than thou, and we want to start looking down at people. And what happens with many people, you get in a place where you're comfortable, or whether you're so comfortable with your own sin or your own faults that you kind of get used to them, and you're walking around with a big plank in your eye, not paying attention to it, then you want to start piddling around in other people's business, and they don't even really have anything going on, but yet you're noticing those things. And that's what happens. So we need to ask ourselves, what's in your eye? Now, if you don't wear glasses, you probably can't relate to this, but I remember the first time I ever went and got glasses. I went and had my first eye exam. I was already an adult. I was in my 20s, and I went and had an eye exam. And that's the first time I realized I couldn't see. I mean, I thought my sight was normal until they started moving those lenses around, and I'm like, oh, that's what you're supposed to. That's what it's supposed to look like. I didn't realize that I had needed glasses, and so I was walking around to me, which I thought was normal vision and normal seeing things, when I really realized I wasn't seeing things as clearly as I should. I'm actually nearsighted, so I can't see things far away. Now that was the hardest thing it took me. Nearsighted and farsighted is the opposite of each other. When you're nearsighted, you can't see far away. Farsighted, you can't see close up, which it should be the other way around, I think. But anyway, that doesn't have anything to do with it. But it took me seeing clearly through a correct lens for me to see that I couldn't see. I was blind to my own eyesight, so to speak. And so it's funny how we're kind of that way with the world. We don't realize that we've got something obstructing our vision. We've got a big plank sticking out of our eye. We can't see because we've got sin. And then, yet at the same time, even though we can't really see, we're noticing little things going on in other people's lives. And it's not that little speck doesn't matter. It's like I said, when you get a little speck of sawdust or something in your eye, it's irritating. But it's not nearly as painful as something like this that we're carrying around. But more than that, it's really offensive to other people that here, they know we've got this big old huge thing sticking out of our eye, and then we're worried about the little speck in their eye. That doesn't make much sense, does it? It's no wonder people think Christians are hypocrites, or people are judgmental when you're going around ignoring the things in your life, and you've got that going on in your life. Something a lot bigger. In Proverbs chapter 10, verse 7, the proverb writer said, "Whoever heeds discipline shows the way of life, but whoever ignores correction will lead others astray." And I think we can't ignore what's going on in our lives. We can't ignore the blind spots and things in our lives and deal with other things. We need to deal with ourselves first and get ourselves right first before we even begin the process of trying to help others. You can't lead someone to Christ if you haven't led yourself to Christ. You can't teach someone else about repentance if you haven't repented. You can't be a good example to someone or expect someone else to be a godly Christian when we're not. So we have to look at our own self and be honest with ourselves. It's so easy to sit around and look at the faults of others or self-conceit faults. Sometimes we point out faults in others and they may not even be faults. We're just trying to put them down. And people do that for different reasons. Sometimes we're insecure. Sometimes we're jealous. Sometimes we're set in our ways. And so sometimes we think things and other people, we look down on other people, we judge them or criticize them unfairly because of our own problems. But then sometimes it may be legitimate. But it's kind of like me coming up and getting on you for jaywalking while I just went and robbed a bank and shot somebody and killed them. That's kind of what the comparison is. I mean, if you really think about it, I'm going to go up to you and say, "You're going to hell because you didn't use a crosswalk. Forget about what I just did. That's not important. You're breaking traffic violations here." That's how silly that sounds, but that's what we do in our day-to-day lives. We gripe that someone don't go to the right church, or they don't dress a certain way, or we don't do certain things a certain way, and yet we've got some type of different things in our life that are much bigger issues. But that's why I believe the proverb gives us a good point here, that we need to allow discipline and correction in our life, because if we don't do that, if we ignore correction, we're blind to our own selves, guess what? That's going to lead other people astray. In this sense, it's going to lead people astray in the sense that we're going to turn people off from church or God when we're judgmental or critical or partial people unfairly, when we know we've got a lot worse things. We've all been around people who claim to be Christians and they're the biggest gossips in town, or they're talk about everybody and they talk people down and they criticize and talk about people and their problems are a lot worse. Don't be that type of person. Try to be the best you can be, but in order to be the best you can be, the only way you're going to help others, the only way you're going to help others truly be successful in their faith is if we've got our faith going in the right direction as well. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 13, Paul told Timothy, Even though I was once a blasphemer and a persecutor and a violent man, I was shown mercy because I acted in ignorance and unbelief. So Paul understood, even though he was not a very good person at one time, he blasphemed against God, he persecuted Christians, he had them thrown in prison and killed. He realized that he was shown mercy because at that point he acted in ignorance and unbelief. And so what I'm saying is, we too need to realize that we were all once sinners. Those of us who are saved, those of us who are Christians, we at too once was lost. We at too once struggled with sin, or we at once was in a place where we weren't what we should have been. And so Paul's reminding Timothy, hey, I did a lot of stupid things, but I was acting in ignorance. I didn't know, or I wasn't willing to believe. And so we need to look at ourselves sometimes and say, hey, I wasn't always a Christian, or I wasn't always a good Christian. And so I need to get myself right before I start condemning other people for things that especially when I'm condemning them or judging them or criticizing them for something that's insignificant, and I've got a lot bigger problems going on in my life. So we need to be careful not to do that. But again, it brings me to my second point, that we're really blind to our own eye. We've got this big plank hanging out of our eye, and we're going around checking out everybody's sawdust specks going on in the world, and we're ignoring, we're blind to ourselves. We might call that we're in denial, or we're self-unaware, but the truth is, we've got a lot bigger problems than what's going on. If you look at verse 4 of our text, Jesus said, how can you say to your brother, let me take that speck out of your eye, when all the time there's this plank in your eye? That's insulting. If I knew someone was going around doing a lot of bad things in their life, maybe they were a drug addict, or maybe they were an alcoholic, maybe they weren't very morally correct, and they were doing a lot of immoral things, to come up and tell me that I wasn't a good Christian, I would be insulted or offended by that. It's funny what offends us, and yet we're blind to our own faults. And I'm telling you, as Christians, and we all struggle with this, including myself, we have got to be more self-aware. We've got to be more self-aware of ourselves and our faults. And realize I'm not going to influence the world for Jesus. I'm not going to make a difference in the world if I'm carrying around a bunch of planks in my eye and trying to get specks out of other people's eyes. And that's why he said we can't be blind to our own eye. How can we help others with their problems when we've got a lot bigger problems that we're not dealing with, or we're in denial about, or we're not admitting to? So I think the goal is for me and you to fix ourselves and work on ourselves, and then we'll be more productive for the Lord. We'll be able to help other people. It's hard to turn the notes when we've got a big old piece of wood up here. But that's also true in life. It's hard to go out living the Christian life when you're carrying around something like this. How can we be a godly example? How can we encourage others? How can we help others when our own vision is blocked? Because the point of having a big plank in your eyes, you're not going to be able to see very well. If you went around in your life with something obstructing your view like this thing, and you couldn't see, you wouldn't be able to be very productive. You'd be bumping into things, you'd be running into things, and not only that, you couldn't see what's right in front of you. And spiritually speaking, that's what he's talking about here. We're going around and we can't see things, yet at the same time we're going around trying to help people get little specks out of their eyes. In Luke chapter 6, verse 39, Jesus told this parable from Luke's perspective. It says, he also told them this parable. Can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall in a pit? We can't lead people to Christ if we're blinded by our own sin. We can't correct people's problems and struggles and help them with things in their life when we're blind to our own sin. What's the result going to be? We're both going to fall into a pit. Well, guess what? When we're not acting very godly and we refuse to be Christ-like, we're being disobedient to God. We're leading ourselves blind, and then we're trying to lead other people. And we can't do that. We need to get the obstructions out of our eyes and get ourselves together so that we can go out and help other people. Some of you may remember the story of the blind man in John chapter 9. And matter of fact, the next sermon is going to be about that, John chapter 9. When he rubbed mud on the guy's eyes. And the whole issue was the Pharisees and religious leaders were mad that Jesus healed the guy because it was a Sabbath. And that's all they cared about. They didn't care that this man had been blind from birth. They cared that he did something on that day that was supposed to. Now, talk about people who were judging specks and had planks out of their eyes. That's who Jesus is really talking about here in Matthew 2, is these religious Pharisees and leaders and all these people thought they were religious. They were people going around with a bunch of planks in their eyes, and they were trying to get specks of sawdust. And it's counterproductive. You can't lead people to Christ with arrogance and ego and judgmentalism and legalism and all these harsh things. You know, you can't tell people you love them and then act that way. And most of those people are people who have big planks in their eyes, and they're going around trying to get specks out of people's eyes. But anyway, Jesus healed this man and began this discussion, about, did he sin, did his parents sin? And it went on, the religious people were confronting him, because they wanted to get an answer. They were trying to trap Jesus and trying to say Jesus was a sinner. In John chapter 9, verse 25, the blind man said this. Whether he was a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know is I was blind, but now I see. That was all that mattered to him. It wasn't about whether Jesus was a sinner or not, or what day it was. All he knew that he'd been blind his whole life, and all of a sudden he could see. And you talk about perspective and priorities, that's what mattered. And so what matters to us is, we need to realize that these specks that are out there in this world that we see in other people that we think are so bad, we've got a lot bigger problems in our lives that we need to deal with first before we go out doing that. So it's all about perspective. So we need to get the things out of our way that's causing us to be blind so that we can go out and help people with their minor problems that's going on in their life. And maybe that's all it takes, because let me tell you, when you've got stuff going on in your life, you're not going to have very much influence in the world to help someone when you've got a lot of bigger problems. Now, I don't know about you, but you probably don't want someone like Joan Collins has been married 8 times giving you his marital advice. I don't know if you do that or not. You might not want someone, these guys that embezzle that money giving you financial advice. You don't want people doing things for you that they haven't accomplished all themselves. And we certainly don't want Christians who are not living a Christian life giving us life on how to be a Christian. So we've got to learn to not be blind to ourselves. I really like what Peter did in 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 3 through 9. He gives a great explanation of what a Christian's attitude and behavior should be like because they know Jesus. If you look at 2 Peter chapter 1, beginning with verse 3, he says, "In His divine power He has given us everything we need for a godly life through our knowledge of Him who called us by His own glory and goodness. Through these He has given us His very great and precious promises, so that through them you may participate in the divine nature, having escaped the corruption in the world caused by evil desires. For this very reason, make every effort to add to your faith goodness, and to goodness knowledge, and to the knowledge self-control, and to self-control perseverance, and to perseverance godliness, and to godliness mutual affection, and to mutual affection love. For if you possess these qualities in increasing measure, they will keep you from being ineffective and unproductive in your knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. But whoever does not have them, guess what? Is nearsighted and blind, forgetting what they have been cleansed from in their past sins." So Peter paints a picture for us here that, hey, if you're living for God, you're going to keep adding these attributes to your life. I mean, we've got all these promises from God, all this goodness from God, and because of that, we've escaped all the things, these evil desires and sin. And that we start to be going from being faithful to good, and good to knowledgeable, self-control. He goes through all these things, and he says we'll be productive and we'll continue to increase and be productive for God in the world. However, if you don't have these qualities, if you don't have this type of attitude, if you're not self-aware, if you're not self-disciplined, if you don't pay attention to your own life, guess what's going to happen? You're going to be nearsighted and blind, forgetting that you've been saved and cleansed from your past sins. And I think that's what happens to us. We forget where we came from. We forget that God's grace saved us, and that we're just a sinner that's saved by grace. That we're just someone who was once lost and now we're found. We're no better than anybody else, we just might be better off. And so even though we might, people might have some little specks in their eyes and things they need to work on, we need to work on ourselves so that we're not blind to our own faults. The third thing I'd like us to understand is really the important point is not only do we need to look at our eye first and see what's in it, we don't need to be blind to our own sins, but thirdly, we don't want to be a hypocrite. We don't want to be someone who says one thing and does another. Now, this word is thrown around a lot. This word is used a lot. People say, well, I don't want to go to church because it's full of hypocrites. Well, listen, the church hasn't cornered the market on hypocrites. There's hypocrites everywhere you go. You go to Walmart today, there's going to be some hypocrites up there. You go out to eat somewhere, there's going to be hypocrites there. You go to your job tomorrow, there's going to be hypocrites there. There's hypocrites everywhere. It's not like you can't be a hypocrite until you become a Christian. Because there's all kinds of people in this world who are not religious, or not Christians, or maybe they're other religions or no religion at all. Guess what? what? There's all kinds of people out there that say one thing and do another. That's not hypocrite's not a Christian thing that's just reserved for Christians. The word hypocrite comes from a word pretending to be something not, but it comes back in Greek days, or back in those days, they would have plays, theater productions, and an actor would play several parts in the play or the production. So in order to show that he was a different character, they would put on different masks. And that's really what that means. And so that word hypocrite comes out of that original word, but it means to put on a mask, pretend to be something you're not. And that's what a lot of people do as Christians. We're hypocritical because we say one thing and do another, or we judge you for something small and insignificant, and we've got a lot of bigger problems in our life. Look at verse 5. This is what Jesus says to do. He says, you hypocrites. Jesus is calling them out for being hypocritical. He says, take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will be able to see clearly the speck from your brother's eye. What Jesus was really saying is, how can you even see specks in other people's eyes until you remove the plank from your eye? Stop being a hypocrite. Stop saying one thing and doing another. First, get the plank out of your eye, then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. And what an influence that me and you would have when people saw that we had some planks in our lives that we removed. Would that be inspirational? And isn't it great when you see someone who was really far from Christ, and probably someone you didn't expect to become a Christian, and they did a 360 and just totally gave their life to Christ, or a 180. They didn't do a 180, not a 360. So they did a 360 back to the sinner, 180. But my point being is, it's a witness, it's an inspiration, it's encouraging when you see someone life change. They get serious about God. And I believe Jesus is telling us we would have a lot better influence if we wouldn't be hypocritical. Stop judging people for the things they're doing until you get your stuff together. You know what I mean? Get that plank out of your eye, and then you'll be able to help people. You'll be able to be an influence. You'll be able to make a difference. And it's easy, and that's probably why we do it. It's easy to set and point fingers at other people's faults. It's easy to point out so-and-so should be doing this, so-and-so should be doing that. Look at how they're dressed, look at where they're at, look at how they're acting, look at who they're hanging out with, look at what they said. And while in the meantime, our problems are a lot more serious. And Jesus is saying, stop being that way. Stop being hypocritical. Stop saying one thing and doing another. Because you'll have a lot greater influence if you remove the plank from your eye, and people realize that. Then they'll be a lot more prone, or a lot more apt, or a lot more open to you helping them with the specks in their eyes. God doesn't want us to do anything and be hypocritical. Matter of fact, God doesn't want anything to do with hypocrisy. In Psalm 26, verse 4, it says, the psalmist said this about God, I do not sit with the deceitful, nor do I associate with hypocrites. God doesn't want anything to do with people who are deceitful and people who are hypocritical. God doesn't want people like that. Matter of fact, I'm sure Jesus, or God, sometimes cringes when he hears people saying, oh, I'm a Christian, or I'm a member of such and such church, and they're out being hypocrites out in the world. So, there's enough people out there in this world that are being hypocritical. And there's even people out there that are going to call you hypocrites unfairly sometimes. But we need to take some action ourselves individually to change our hypocritical behaviors, our hypocritical attitudes, because our hypocrisy is damaging to relationships. It's damaging to the church, and it's damaging to God. Now, when we are hypocritical, when we say one thing and do another, it hurts God, it hurts the church, it hurts ourselves, it hurts those around us. When you do things, you're not just keeping it to you. It's not just you think, well, I'm not hurting anybody, I'm not doing anything wrong. Well, yes, you are. You're hurting a lot of people in the process. And you need to be careful that you're not hypocritical. Jesus, as a matter of fact, was not kind to religious folks in his day. Well, he just said he would call those people hypocrites who were being that way. As a matter of fact, later on in Matthew chapter 23, it's a section where it's called the 7 Woes, where Jesus confronted the hypocritical behavior of the religious leaders and Pharisees of that day. And he went on and gave them all these hypocritical things they were doing. Because the Pharisees and religious leaders of Jesus' time were very big plank-eye people. They had all these things that they were doing, corruption and arrogance and ego. And they were forcing things on people that they weren't willing to do themselves, and they had all this going on. And Jesus calls them out on it. But I want to focus on what he says in Matthew chapter 23, verse 7, in one of those sections. He said, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of bones of the dead and everything unclean. Jesus says, look at that. whether that's Arlington or somewhere else, that's beautiful. It looks pretty. They've got all these nice, uniform, white, pretty tombstones. But let's forget. We get focused on that, and I think that's beautiful and nice. But let's be honest. What is that? That's a graveyard. There's a bunch of dead, rotting carcasses in the ground there. I mean, that's what it is. Our bodies go back to the earth, and we go back, and our bodies go back to the earth, and they decay and rot and go back to the earth. I know that's not the pretty picture you want to see there. We want to see all the beautiful tombs and flowers and green. But the truth is, that's what Jesus is saying about religious people who are hypocrites. You put on this image on the outside that you're this whitewashed, beautiful tomb. But the inside, you're full of bones of dead and everything unclean. Now, Jews understood this because they were very big about unclean, things that were dead, not touching them, and especially bodies. And so he was hitting them where it hurt. He was saying that's exactly what you're like. But I think Jesus really does a good job summing up what a hypocrite is. It's something that looks clean and pretty and beautiful on the outside, but the inside is the complete opposite. And we don't want to be like that. We want to be someone who is honest and sincere about our faith, that works on ourselves and takes care of ourselves, not saying that we're perfect, not saying that we have it all together, but we're not ignoring the sin and the faults and problems in our lives and then trying to help people with theirs that are a lot smaller. When I first went into ministry, I was a youth minister. In my first youth ministry, I had a slogan that I used with the youth group. And that slogan was changing others by changing yourselves. And the reason why I used that is because I used to always emphasize, you can't expect to change other people when you don't change yourselves. As Christians, we can't go out and change the world and community for the name of Christ, with the name of Christ, when Christ hasn't even changed us. And so we have to work on ourselves and get ourselves right. We can only influence people for Christ when Christ has influenced us. And so we can't change others until we change ourselves. We can't get specks out of people's eyes until we remove the planks from our eyes. We can't help others until we help ourselves. I don't know why it's difficult for us to get that concept, but it is sometimes. And there are people who have their life is full of problems and are unhealthy. And what do they want to do? They want to go get in a relationship with someone and get in toxic relationships. And it's great advice. You can't love someone and treat someone good until you get yourself right. All you're doing is damaging and hurting another person. But people do it all the time. They try to find love in all the wrong places. They think they're going to find answers by dating some guy or some girl who's going to solve all the problems. But the truth is, until you get your life right, until you get yourself healthy, all you're doing is causing damage in their life. You're just spilling over your mess into their life and making a mess out of theirs. And that's kind of how we are if we don't fix ourselves, if we don't work on ourselves. We're going to be toxic, we're going to hurt people, we're going to hurt the message of the gospel, we're going to hurt people, the church, and all this until we stop being hypocritical and we get our mess fixed. And then when you work on yourself, then guess what? You're going to be at peace, you're going to have hope, you're going to be an influence to people, you're going to make a difference. So we need to get healthy spiritually ourselves before we can help others. But don't throw in the towel and give up. Anything that's worth getting is going to be difficult, it's going to be hard, but guess what? The results will be so rewarding. That's why we look forward to having, because getting there, once we get there, it'll be worth everything that we went through on this earth. So I want to encourage you to not be hypocritical, to not ignore the plank in your eye, and to not be blind to your own self, because you could help people so much more if you would get the plank out of your eye. We're going to offer our invitation now.